Hello again, this is Tim Corey, and in this video, I'm going to introduce you to WPF. But before I do, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping things. First, if you haven't already subscribed to my email list, you might want to pause this video just for a minute and do that. The link is in the description. My email subscribers hear about things first, and they get to weigh in on what comes next. I also reward my subscribers with discounts and special offers on my paid courses. Second, you'll also notice a link to my Facebook page down there. I'd really appreciate it if you would head over to my Facebook page and just give it a like as well. That's the place where I'm going to be giving more specific feedback on what you want to see next in these videos. If you want your content to be better aligned with your direction as a developer, Facebook is the place to go to give that feedback. All right, so enough housekeeping, let's dive into WPF. Here I have Visual Studio 2017. Now, if you're using 2015 or earlier, it's probably about the same, but just know that I'm the latest version here, and the latest version is free. So if you go to visualstudio.com, you can find the community edition for free there. So go ahead and get that if you're able. Now, here what I'm going to do is we're going to start a new project by going to New Project right down here. Now, you could just look for WPF here, or you could search for it here on the left. But the tricky thing here that you want to make sure you avoid is getting the wrong version of WPF. Note the 7 or 8 different options we have here. We don't want most of these options. In fact, we only want one. And the one you want is actually the top one, the WPF app.NET framework. And it's in Visual C#. There's also one here. Note it's for Visual Basic. That's not what we want. You can also go to Windows Classic over here on the left, Templates, Visual C#, select Windows Classic, and you'll find WPF app. So we're going to select this WPF app.NET framework. Let's name this WPF demo. Now I'm going to give my project name and my solution name the same name just because it's easiest. That's the simplest way for one project, one solution. But I would recommend that if you're going to create a quote unquote real application or going to move forward with this in a more professional manner, what I typically do is say something like WPF UI, or all caps WPF UI. Looks a little funny, but it's an acronym. There's 2 acronyms actually. And then I'd call this the demo project or something like that. Just so you have a solution name that's separate from your user interface, because your user interface could change, and also it doesn't represent your entire solution if it's named after just your user interface. Because you really should have a class library, and you should have some other stuff possibly. And so the project name and solution name usually should be different. But in this case, I'm going to say WPF demo, and the same for the solution. And we'll hit OK here and create a project. Now, while it's doing that, let's talk about what the difference is between WPF and WinForms. Because this is really kind of the same ballpark that the two operate in. They're kind of the same-ish, but they're not the same. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you've probably seen a lot of WinForms. WinForms is what came first, and it's also the easiest to use. Now, why create WPF? Well, Microsoft wanted to have a form application that could be more modern in feel. And WinForms is just kind of limited by some of the old school stuff that's kind of still dragging along with it. And they've tried to make it a little more modern. They try to clean it up. They've done a great job. But the reality is it's still old school. And one of the ways that's really evident is whenever you get into anything graphical with WinForms. WinForms still uses GDI, which is a way of rendering things that pulls right from the CPU, the processor. And so it really puts a burden on the processor and slows things down. Now that used to be how we did everything back in the 90s. But then we got video cards, and video cards were dedicated to rendering and displaying video and other graphical elements. And so WPF says, well, we don't want to base our stuff on GDI. We want to use DirectX and actually talk to the video card, which means that if you want to, you can create a 3D form that it's a cube and it spins in air and every side has a different video playing on it. And it will work. You might need a bigger video card, but it will work. And that's definitely something you could not do in WinForms. Now, that's not exactly a normal line of business application, but there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. Now, we're not going to get in depth into all that really deep stuff, but I wanted to at least give you an overview of how to get started in WPF and really understand the basics of what's going on here. The other thing that WPF does differently is data binding. And data binding is really big in WPF. You can data bind to anything. And that's not really true in WinForms, not as much. And so there's a lot of power there, but it also adds a layer of complexity. And so we're going to kind of touch on that a little bit. And finally, WPF it's a little bit more like HTML and CSS in the idea that you can apply a style at the project level or at the form level or the item level. And so we'll see some of those properties we're going to add that we're kind of familiar with, but are a little bit different, a little bit tweaked. So those are the kind of things that make WPF a little different. Like I said, it's a little bit bigger of a barrier to entry than WinForms is. WinForms is a drag and drop and just get started. And you can really start in WinForms in day one. Whereas WPF is a little bit more time consuming to get started. And so I want to kind of reduce that barrier of entry a little bit and kind of just give you an overview of how WPF works. So we've got our form here that we've created. This is the starter form. It's essentially form 1 if you're familiar with the WinForms, but this is actually called main window. So this is form 1, and right off the bat, if you look just up here at this window, it looks pretty much the same as what we're used to. In fact, if we run this, let me start this real quick, it's going to look almost identical to a WinForm application. And actually start over here. So this is it. This is the blank form. It looks a little different, but it kind of works the same. It has our 3 buttons up here: minimize, maximize, and close. This is extra, and this is actually a WPF debugging thing. And so I'll show you how to turn that off in a minute. But this allows us to do some debugging around WPF. But this is not actually part of our form. And if we were to run this outside of Visual Studio, we would not get this black box. And you can move it around if you want. Right, like that. So let's close this out now, and let's look at what our form is made up of. Now, in WinForms, the code behind is empty, which it is here as well. If we right-click on this and say View Code, it looks identical to WinForms. We have just the constructor, and it has the initialized components. It's a partial class. That's all there really is to it. But if you look, we have this extra thing down here. And this is where people get a little bit lost or a little bit confused or even scared. This is XAML or XAML. And what XAML is the design system for building this form. And it's XML essentially, but it's the extensible application markup language instead of just extensible markup language. So this is what Microsoft created in order to help us build these forms. And so everything you put on this form is going to have XAML down here to correspond to that element. So for example, I'm going to show you how to drag and drop and put a button on the form. Now, before we go any further, I want you to pause for a minute and listen to what I'm saying right now, because this is important. Don't do that. Don't drag and drop onto a WPF form. That's not how they're designed. Okay? I'll show you how to do it safely, but the reality is you should probably avoid it almost entirely. And that's the first place where people get tripped up, is they treat it like a WinForm application, come to their toolbox, and just start dragging things on. That really reduces the power of WPF, and essentially it makes it so that you really should have just used WinForms. Because if you're going to take away all the power of WPF, there's no point to it, and it's just added complexity for no real reason. So don't drag and drop. But I did. Okay? And the reason I did is I want to show you what this does. Notice down here in our XAML, we now have this line of text. Let's actually unpin it so you can actually see the whole line of text. So you have button, and then it says x:\name equals button. Content equals button. That's the actual text inside the button. This is the name of the button. Horizontal alignment is left. Here's the margin. So it's aligned to the left. It's got a margin of this. It's got a vertical alignment to top and the width of 75. The reason why drag and drop onto our window here is bad is because of all of this stuff right here. And what is that? Well, it's hard-coded locations. Now again, WinForms, we're used to this. We have to have this. There's no other way of doing this other than having hard-coded locations. But in WPF, it's different. And so we're going to treat it differently. But I wanted to show you at least the fact that the XAML changes. So I'm going to take this away, and we're going to start over. Now the very first thing you need to know about XAML is the grid system. And so that's typically what you have on the form is a grid. And a grid can have multiple elements inside of it. And that's important because certain items can have only one element inside them. Other elements can have multiple items inside them. The grid can have multiple. Now think of the grid a little bit like an Excel spreadsheet, except that right now we only have one cell. And that's this entire window. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually put some grids on here. So we can actually have different places to put things. Where I do that is by inside grid. And this important thing to note here, if you're not familiar with open and closing tags, this is an open tag, this is a close tag. Okay, the bottom one down, it's kind of highlighting both of them. The bottom one down here is a close tag because it has a slash in front of grid. So this is an open tag, and we have to do things outside of these brackets to be inside the grid. So between this bracket right here and this bracket. So open tag, close tag, inside here, we need to create new items or new elements. So we open up our, essentially what is a less than sign, and we say grid.column definitions. Notice we have IntelliSense, which is nice. IntelliSense is not perfect in XAML. It's a little ugly in some spots, but it gets the job done. Notice when I closed out essentially my greater than sign here, when I closed that out, it gave me the close tag. This is an open tag, now a close tag. Inside here, this is the column definitions. So how many columns do I have going down here on my grid? So the first column I'm going to say column definition, and I have to give it a width. So the first one I'm going to give, here's what I do. I give my first and last column a 20 pixel width. And the reason why is it creates this nice little border around my form where we don't put things right up to the edge of the form. There's a little bit of white space on the edge of our form. So that's how I do things. You don't have to do it the same way, but that's just kind of my standard. Now this is what's called a self-closing, in that we put a slash at the end, and now this is both the open and the close. So it only has the stuff in here to apply any kind of modification to a column definition. So this is now defined one column. I'm going to do this a few more times. I'm going to copy this and paste it. But instead of the width of 20, now 20 represents pixels, We don't say 20px like you would in HTML or CSS. Instead, we just say 20. But in WPF, we don't typically specify hard and fast widths or heights. We try to avoid those kind of things as much as possible. And the reason why is because a WPF form can be flexible. It can grow to fill the space it needs. It can shrink to fit the space that it has available to it. And that's one of the real big improvements that everyday applications get to use. It used to be, I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but it used to be we had monitors that had a screen ratio of 800 pixels by 600 pixels. Something small like that. And then we had these big complicated forms. Well, the problem was our form might have been designed for a 1024 by 768 screen. What happens when you get it on a 800 by 600 screen? Well, in WinForms, it means you can't see the right-hand side or the bottom of the form. That's really a problem because usually in the bottom of the form is where the submit button is. And it didn't even put a nice scroll bar so you could scroll. It was just off a screen. And that was a real problem. We actually had to design our applications knowing what the smallest screen resolution was going to be and then not making the form any bigger than that. And that's really ugly. Now, we shouldn't have that today, but there are other issues that come along with screen sizes. For example, you might have a small form, and if you maximize that thing, in WinForms, all the stuff's in the upper left-hand corner, and you have just gray space on the rest of the screen. That's not very pleasant to look at. In WPF, we can have a more responsive design where the form kind of fills the screen however big the screen is or however small the screen is. We can also do things like show more stuff if there's more real estate available to us. And so WPF's a lot of flexibility there, but you can't lock it down to set widths and heights. And so as much as possible, we avoid set pixels. So I want you to think, whenever you see a pixel number, so for example 20, whenever you see that in WPF, I want you to pause and say, is this right? And assume that it's not. Now, in this case, it is correct. I want to have that set border no matter how big or how small the window gets. That does mean that the window gets to be 40 pixels high by 40 pixels wide. We'd see nothing but border. And you know what? At that point, yeah, you probably should, because it's a stupid small window. There's not really a point to it. So that's what I specify for my border, but I don't want my border here. I want to have a normal column. And so what I specify is auto. And what auto allows me to do is WPF says, we're going to handle the width of this column based upon whatever you put in it. And so you put something really wide in it, the column's going to be wide. If you put something kind of small in there, the column's going to be small. Think of it kind of like an HTML table, if you're familiar with those. So the table would get bigger or smaller depending on what goes inside them. So that's what we're going to have for our normal columns. I'm going to copy this and paste it a couple more times. Now let's actually make this a little smaller. Now I'm going to paste it one more time, but I'm going to change this. Instead of auto, I'm going to put star. Now what star says is that it's going to take up the rest of the available width. Notice up here we have this one star now. And so we've got a width here of 20. So that's this column right here. We have 3 autos. They're not really showing. That's because they're all in this line. Because there's nothing in the column, therefore their width is 0. And then we have a star that takes up the rest of the space. And I put that on the right-hand side. So this goes far left to far right. Now the reason I did this is because otherwise, if I didn't have a star column, these auto columns would all take up the same amount of space and kind of fill in the gaps here. And that's not really what I want. I want to have one column fill in the rest. So I have this one column here that takes up the rest of the space on my form, and so it will grow or shrink depending on what the other columns do. That's perfect. And I'm going to take this, copy this first one, and put it at the end. Now I have my column at the end, again with that 20 pixels of white space. And that's all there is to defining columns. You have your grid.column definition. Inside there you define the number of columns you want and what the sizes are going to be. Now, just so you know, you can have multiple star columns. If you do, each column will take, if you have two, each column will take half of the leftover space. If you have three, each will take a third. And so it's just kind of divvies up whatever's left over the number of star columns available. And I just use one usually. Also note that the number of columns I put here is, at this point, kind of just by feel. I think I'll probably need 3 columns at least. So I just put 3 here, but you know what? If I need more, I just copy and paste and put more in. Now, we'll see how to reference these in a little bit, but for right now, I just want to let you know that we reference these columns on a 0-based counting array. So this is column 0, column 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So 0 through 5. There's a total of 6 columns. So that's our columns. Now, if you are thinking ahead, you'll probably think, okay, that means if we have columns, we probably have rows. And you are correct. And you can probably guess how we define rows. Grid.row definitions. Inside here, we say row definition. And instead of instead of width, because it's not a column, it's a row, and rows get height. So again, what we're going to do is say 20. Now note you cannot hit the double quote here. It just adds one. In C#, it would kind of skip over that since you hit double quote and it knows it's there, but you can't in XAML. It's one of those shortcuts that I wish they had in XAML. They just haven't gotten around to yet. And again, this is a self-closing row. So close it out. And we'll do the same thing here. We're going to copy and paste this. We're going to change this to be auto. Same deal here. Auto works the same way. It's just in rows instead of columns. And usually I add a few more rows than I do columns just because we have more stuff going on. And then the last one, or the second to last one I hit is a star. And then one last one I set again to our 20. So now we have our first and our last row are 20 pixels high. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows that are auto height, and then one that is that star height. So we have our columns and we have our rows. So that's great. Now, to this point, you're probably thinking, man, we're not using our screen real estate very good. Let's see if we can change that up. And we can. We have these buttons over here. Let's zoom in here. So these buttons right here, one has a horizontal line. That's what we're currently highlighting. And what that indicates is this configuration right here, where we have our XAML on the bottom and our design on the top, or vice versa. In fact, we can switch that using this swap button here. So we could switch that around and totally mess you up, but we'll keep it the way it is. So that's this line, this horizontal line over here represents this relationship right here, whereas the vertical line right here represents a vertical split, and that looks like this. And that's usually a little bit easier because usually we have a widescreen monitor and so we have a little more space. Now what I typically do is I'll try and move my window around and then shrink down one side. You can do that. So we can actually still see our whole window, but have a little more real estate on the right to work in our XAML. It's not a perfect world, but it's a little closer. And if you are not dealing with the increased font size that I have on mine for video, you'll probably be able to see a little more on your screen than I do on mine. So this gives us a little better view of XAML. Oh, don't forget as well, those down here. Those are our icons. So again, you can switch back to our horizontal split. We can also collapse one of the panes and just see either the XAML or the actual window. So there's a lot you can do with it. The one thing that I have not found how to do, and I'd love for someone to find out how to do this, or for someone to actually get this pushed through as a change, is I'd love to be able to separate my XAML from my UI. And so I could pull this, say it's 2 tabs now instead of having just one pane split in half. That way I could take this side over here and put it on a different monitor. But you can't do that. That's kind of a bummer. But I'd love to be able to do that so I have my actual live output view in one monitor and my XAML on a different monitor. But that's not something that WPF is set up for yet. That'd probably be, Tim's wish list number 1 for WPF. A close number 2 is that being able to hit the double quote and just skipping over instead of adding an extra one. Okay, so we've gone through, we've added our columns and our rows, which seems kind of boring. And in fact, if we run this, it would look no different because these columns and rows are invisible. They don't actually show anything. So let's actually add something here to make it a little more useful. All right, so let's start with a very simple label, or in this case, it's called a text block. Now, if you're not sure what you're looking for, here's what you can do. Go to your toolbox and look for the different items. In fact, here's text block, here's text box, which, that's great. Block and box. We can't get those two mixed up, right? But block is the one that's a label, essentially. Now, there's a separate one for label, but typically we just use text block. Essentially what it is just text on the screen. I think label is a little more associated with a text box, but it all comes down to just displaying text. And so I end up using just text block usually. So if you weren't sure what to put in here, you could look over here and get the name and just type it out, or you could even drag and drop it either on the XAML or the form and then modify it. But just make sure you take off all of those, left align and top and left and all the stuff that locks it down to a certain spot. All right, so, but I'd recommend if you can learn it, that'd be great, or look over here and just start typing that. Now note that since I clicked off of my XAML, it tried to render it over here and it said, oh, nope, that's invalid markup. And with invalid markup, it breaks things. And see, if you could take that away, back comes the window, that's great. So if you have invalid markup, then it's going to yell at you until you get it right. And there is some IntelliSense down here saying, okay, here's the problem. Our error reporting are little squigglies. But just know that you have to have valid XAML in order for the form to show. Which, again, it's a little more difficult than WinForms because you can get it wrong. But at the end of the day, it usually comes down to just close out your item. There I close out my text block with a slash at the end, and life is good again. So you can do that if you want. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's get a text block. I'm going to say, I want it to be grid.column. And remember I said before that our columns and rows are zero-based counting. So if I want to specify that it goes in a certain column and a certain row, I have to start at 0. The cool thing though is, since I use this 20 here, which is essentially a buffer column and a buffer row, I can actually go down one below, and that's column 1. So my thought process, or my best practice for myself, is I say I never put anything in column 0 or row 0. It always starts in column 1. And so in this case, column 1 and row 1. So the column is 1 and the grid dot row is 1 as well. I'm going to close out the tag, and then inside between the closing and the opening, I'm just going to put text. Let's say hello world. And check it out. We have hello world right up here. Now the first thing you might notice is that it's kind of small. It's, how do we specify the height of this font? Well, we didn't. And so it took the overall default. But we can change that. Now I could say, right inside next to grid.row, before the close of the opening text block, I could say font size equals, let's go with 18. And now it's bigger. All right, in fact, I can change it again. And I can say 28. And it's bigger again. Notice this row has gotten larger because the label inside it is larger. Now, what if I didn't know the font size that I wanted? Well, if you're selecting text block, you can open up properties. Now remember, properties, just like in WinForms, properties allows us to modify the properties of whatever element we're selecting. In this case, text block. So we could say the text is hello world. We could change that if you wanted to. In fact, we could say hi world. And we click off this, notice that if we scroll over here, now it says text equals hi world. Now, why it changed this? Well, I had it between the opening and closing tag of text block. But the properties window says, not really. That's not where it should go. It instead should go in the text property of the text block, and it should be a self-closing tag. The text block is. So it changed a little bit, and it also changed the value here to hi world. Notice over here, one is a little smaller here, but it says hi world. Now, note these draggable arrow things here. Don't drag them. If you were to drag these, it would resize the column and say that's the width the column has to be. We don't want to change that. We want this to be nothing but auto-adjusted columns and rows. So if you want to see this grid go away, what you can do is click outside this grid tag, but inside the window tag. So right here, the grid goes away. You can see what your form kind of looks like in the real world. Now, let's go back to properties here on the text block. We'll click on there. And we can change things like the text is, I'm not even sure I want to pronounce that. CGO, I'm not sure. But that's the default font, and now we specify the pixel of 28 pixels. That's right there. Notice if we were to change this to something else, let's go to 36. If we were to click off this, watch this right here. It changed the font size to 36, and it gets a little bigger over here. So this property window right here is the same as modifying it directly in XAML. The only difference is, like with our text, where we did it inside between the open and closing tags, if it likes something different, it's going to change it when you make the change. Also note the color here next to the 36. It's white. So you can zoom in there. It's white, and that means it's a local change versus this right here is inherited from system.resource. So WPF has a hierarchy of application of styles, just like CSS does on the web. And so you first have this global style in the system resource, and then you can apply themes, which can be global or for a certain set of forms, and then you can go down and apply at the form level and finally at the local level. And so depending on where it applies, this icon color will change, letting you know that. All right, so and these right here aren't set at all. They're the default. So that's all well and good. Let's actually shrink down the property window so you can see our form again. But there's a couple things I want to show you. First of all, you don't want to specify a font size for every single item on your form. So let's do this. Up here in Window, notice that Window has a whole bunch of stuff we kind of ignored up until now. And most of this stuff you really don't want to change. This is kind of stuff that's bringing it, saying, okay, here's what this should do as far as look and all the rest. And unless you know what you're doing, leave it alone. But there's a couple things we can change. First is the title bar, main window. That's what's up right here. We can change this to our WPF demo, and we'll notice it changes over here in our preview window. Now the height and width are set at 350 and 525. And hopefully you remember my warning and are saying, wait a minute, we've got hard-coded height and width. And that's a problem, right? Yes and no. It's probably not the right height and width you want for your form when you first start up. You might want something different, but just know this is the starting height and width. You can change it to whatever height and width you want going forward once the application is running. You can change it to be 525 by 525, a square. You can change it to be full screen, 1920 by 1080. It's whatever you want it to be at runtime, but the starting height and width are these right here. And so we can change it. In fact, if we were to change this to be 525, notice my form got taller. I'll actually back out of that. So this is something to address, at least think about, should I change the height and width of my form? But there's more we can do here. There's more properties we can actually access. In fact, if we go to properties, you'll see a whole bunch here. But we can say font size equals, let's make it 18. Now what is this? This is now the default font size for this form. Note that it did not change Hi World. And the reason why is because Hi World already has a font size. Therefore, we're not going to override it in order to use our form's global font size. But anything new or anything that does not have a font size specified gets a font size of 18 now. You can also set things like font family. Now, this right here is not IntelliSense backed. And that's probably Tim's wish list number 3, would be to have an IntelliSense list for font family. This is one of those times where I would drop into the properties and go to our font family here and change this to, change this right here. And so you want something different. You know, if you want something a little more fun, you can do that. But typically, you know, say sketch flow print, and there you go. Yeah, it's kind of fun. But typically, this Sigio UI is what we use, or the light version of that as well. I kind of like the light version. It's a little more crisp and clean, I think. But I changed that here instead of changing that right in line, because I can never remember how to spell this. And since there's no IntelliSense, that's a problem for me. And I also rearrange where it's going to be just so I can see it without having to scroll it all to see it. So there's my font size, there's my font family. Notice the font family changed this font's family. That's because I had not specified a font family down here for my text block. So it didn't change the size, but it did change the family. Now if I took out size, let's Control X that, notice that it's not big, but it's not as small as it was. And that's because our font size by default is 18. Now for this one, we're going to make it a little bigger. All right. So let's also add a line break here. In XAML, line breaks don't really matter. So you can add line breaks as you feel necessary in order to make it readable for you. In this case, I don't want to scroll off the right of the screen. I want to see all my properties right in line. Now let's change this hi world to be WPF Super Demo. Now note what that did. That made our column 268 pixels wide, which that's going to be a problem going forward, but that's okay. We're going to deal with that in a minute. But I want to kind of demonstrate the width of this column. Also notice this first row is 48 pixels high because that's what this label needs. Why does it need that much? Because of the font size and how much text is in it. It has nothing to do with setting the width and the height of the label. All right, so now let's add a text box and a text block, both. We're gonna have us, let's say it's first name and then a text box to have us actually type in our first name. So let's start with a text block first. We're gonna put that underneath our label. Right here, we're gonna put first name. Then we're gonna have a text box that says, or allows us to type in our first name. So right down here below our text box, below our text block, but on the same level, we're not going to nest it inside. Notice we're not putting anything inside of our column definitions. That's not where this stuff goes. We define our columns up here, we define our rows up here, down here, just kind of wherever we feel like inside here, we put our other values, our other items. And so what I like to do is I like to keep some sort of order going on here where, column 1, row 1 stuff goes here, column 2, row 1 goes right below it. Kind of going this way up top, then down the next row and this way, then down the next row and this way. That's kind of how I do it, but it's really up to you how you decide you want to do it. In this case, we're going to do text block. We're going to say grid.column, still column 1. And we're going to say grid.row is 2, right below it. We're going to leave off the font size. We will say font weight equals, and let's just say bold. And then I'll say text equals, and our text is going to be first name. And I will do the closeout with a slash, and there's our first name. Notice the font weight didn't really change anything here, and that's because we're using the thin font. And so what we're going to do is actually change the font family to this Seggio UI. So I'll do that right here, like so. Notice it's now very, very bold. So let's change this to be not bold. And it's a little better. You do have some options here. Font weight, there's other things like black, and there's semi-bold and semi-heavy, light and regular and all the rest. You can try out, some work, some don't, depending on the font. Some fonts have the ability to do these things, some fonts do not. So you kind of just play around depending on what you want to do. So there's our text block. I told you that's been confusing. There's our text block that says first name. So let's now create a text box. Group these together, so I'll put it right below. Text box. And this we need to give it a name. So x:name. Why x:name? Well, that's just how XAML does it. So this name is the actual name for our text box. So we'll call this first name text. Now, again, if you come from a WinForm application background, you might have already realized we didn't name this here, we didn't name this. So how do you reference those in code? Well, we don't really. They don't have names. And we could give them names if we wanted to reference them, but we don't have to give them names. And behind the scenes, it probably gives them a name, and I don't really care. All we really care about is what we need to do. In this case, we don't need to give it a name if we don't need to reference it. And so that kind of cuts down the amount of XAML we have to type. So if you don't need to name it, don't. So in this case, we have a text box, first name text, because we assume we're going to access this text box later. And then we could specify other stuff, but for now, let's just close this out. And actually put the closing tag like that. We can change it. There we go. And so now we should have a text box. And where's the text box? It's up there because we didn't give it all this other stuff. So let's do that. Grid.column, column 2. Grid.row, row 2. Now it's right there. And if we put our cursor here, we notice that that's our text box. Not very big, right? Well, in this case, we have to give it some sort of width or minimum width, or otherwise give it a size. So width equals, and again, this is pixels. We can say 300, make it really big. We can say 30 to make it kind of small. And you kind of experiment with what looks good to you. Probably something more like 150 is passable. And this is where our forms start to take shape, but it's a little ugly. In fact, if we move this over here, we notice we have a label up here, first name, and way over here we have our actual text box. We should also get rid of this as well. I don't really find a use for these things here, so let's get rid of them. I can minimize them for now, but we're actually going to get rid of them entirely in just a minute. But first I want to address this issue of this space right here. We can specify that space should be there. So why is it there? Well, the reason it's there is because notice how it ends, or it starts right after, in line after this right here. So this is column 1. And column 1 is the width of the largest item. In this case, our header label, the WPF Super Demo. So since it's that width, the next item that gets put in this column, it's not going to fill that column if it doesn't need to. And in fact, we haven't said make the font size huge and expand to fill the column. Instead, we said here's the font size, here's the font, and here's the actual text. And therefore, it only takes up this much of the column. And this much is then blank. Now, it's not really what we want. We don't want this big label affecting all the rest of the items in the column. How do you fix that? Real simple. We come to our text block, the one that is affecting everything else. And inside of it, we say grid.columnSpan. Now, what column span does is it says, I want this item to go in more than one column. In fact, I want it to go in 2, 3, 4, however many you want. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3 columns before the star column. Let's specify 3. Now notice what happens on our form. Now our text box has shot right over and it's tucked up almost next to first name. Perfect. So now our header label spans multiple columns, which means that it's no longer the largest thing in the column. First name is. That's why this is tucked up right next to it. Now you also might notice that these two are really close together, and so is this to an extent. And so we can also look to address that spacing by adding margins and padding. So let's do this. Let's go down here and say margin equals. Now the margin here allows us to add multiple dimensions. We can add 1. So say let's add 20. And then what it's done is put 20 on every side, 20 pixels. Therefore, it's pushed this down, it's pushed this over, it's not really done anything over here because there's nothing to bump up against, but if it did, it put a space there, and it's also pushed it down 20 pixels from the above row. So this row is essentially 40 pixels larger, and the column is 40 pixels larger. Now we're spanning 3 columns, so it's not a big deal. But for the row itself, the row is pretty high. So that's if you want to specify all 4 dimensions, left, top, right, and bottom, all at once. Or you can say, comma, 0. Now notice we've got 20 on the left, 20 on the right, none up top, and none down below. What this indicates is this is the left and right, this is the top and bottom. But maybe that's not what you want either. Maybe you want to specify a different width of margin for each dimension. In which case you could say, comma, 0, comma, 0. Now notice we have 20 pixels to the left, none up top, none to the right, none down below. Now, in our case, we don't want the padding to be on the left, we want it to be below our label. Which one's below? Well, it goes in a clockwise pattern starting from the left. It goes left, top, right, bottom. Therefore, we can say left, top, right, bottom. Bottom is the last one. Therefore, the last one gets, let's just do 10. Notice now that first name and the text box have both bumped down because we have a 10 pixel margin between our header label and this row. Now, those of you following along will probably think, now wait a minute, you didn't have to do this column definition of 20 on either both the left and the right, and the top and the bottom as well, because you could have just done it with margins. And yeah, kind of. The problem with that is that it's a little hard to manipulate when you're talking about a form that's going to grow and shrink. If the form shrinks too much, you get a problem, and you've also got to make sure you put those margins on the right ones, the right elements. That's a little hard to keep track of. That's why I just do my row definition and my column definition of 20 on both the front end and the back end, just to put those kind of margins in by default, kind of bake them in. It also makes my columns and rows start at 1 instead of 0, which is kind of nice. So now I have a little bit of space here, and now I can move on to my next element I want to add, which is a button. So it's called button. And again, we're going to give it x.name equals, let's call it the submit button. And we're going to give it a content that says run me. And we're going to give it a grid.column of 1 and a grid.row of 3. And there we have our button here. Now notice that it said content. And this is where WPF gets a little tricky sometimes, and that's why it's helpful to have this property window here, is that for a text block, it's called text, and that's what comes out on the screen. For a button, it's called content. Now, the reason it's called content is because instead of putting this here, instead what we could do is not make this a self-closing button, but instead have an open button tag and a closing button tag, and inside of there, put something else. And so you actually have maybe an icon and some words, or an icon, some words, and a swirling, a swirling icon as well. Whatever you want to do, we could do inside this button. But in our case, I just want to put a little bit of text content, therefore it's called content, and there is the text that goes inside of it. So that's it. So there's my button. Now notice my button again is tucked right up underneath first name, and it's also the size of this column and row. Now the reason it's this size is because a button will take up the available space you give it. In fact, just to demonstrate that, let's do this. Grid.columnSpan equals 2. And now my button is this large. Now if I said row span, it wouldn't do a whole lot because those extra rows are empty or autofill, which is going to be 0 unless you tell it to be larger. But what we've done here is you said, okay, this is the height that that row needs to be. And that's based upon the font size run me. But when I do column span, it goes, okay, I can fill that in. And it fills in because this column is an extra 160 pixels, no problem, I'll fill that. And so if we actually spilled it over into the 1 star, we go all the way over to this edge line here. So buttons, unless you specify a height and width, just kind of get bigger or smaller depending on what space you give it. So that's just, kind of showing off what they do. You could say, do you want to change that? You could say, well, here is the maximum height, or here's the height, here's the width. But I kind of like to leave them the way they are and just do margins. And so in this case, I might just do a margin of 10, and boom, there you go. It's shrunk this down, what it's done. It shrunk it down by 10 pixels on each side because it says, okay, this is the total width you have. And it says, okay, let's take 10 pixels on each side, make it white space instead, and it kind of shrinks it down. So that's kind of nice. It centers it then, which is really fun. But we could also say, well, maybe we want to push it down a little further. And if we want to do that, we'd have to put a margin below the text block and text box. Otherwise, it'd be kind of funky looking. So the key here is WPF is very, very flexible, but you have to kind of think through what you really want to do with that flexibility. You can't just kind of throw things together. Now, again, just to come back to my soapbox a little bit, we didn't drag and drop anything on here because you want to have this flexibility of expansion and change based upon our form size. Now, right now, our form doesn't change a whole lot based upon the size because it's kind of all locked in a little bit, but we can make that a little more flexible and actually make it grow and shrink depending on our how the form is sized. But for now, we're just going to kind of leave this as a simple demo. We're not going to get into the really in-depth stuff. So that's kind of the basics of a form. We've got our header label, we've got our text box, we've got our button. Now let's actually wire this button up and do something. So I click on my button here and go to Properties. And notice in the upper right-hand corner, we have this lightning bolt, which indicates events, just like we do in WinForms. And we have the click event, so I can double click on this, and it actually creates the submit button _ click, which is great. That's one of the reasons why I named this submit button before I created that event, because I wanted to have it say submit button _ click instead of button _ click. So that's kind of important. The other thing is note that it's still just XAML. So click equals submit button _ click. So if you didn't want to go to the property window, change to events, double click the right one, you could have said click equals and then put in your event. Also note, if you want to get rid of this event, the event's now gone. Now the code's still there, but we can safely delete this code because it's not attached to anything. And that's one of the kickers of WinForm was if you deleted the code before you deleted the event, then what would happen is it would cause the WinForm to crash and it'd be a real pain to try and get back. Whereas this is all out in the open. We can just modify it and we're good to go. So let's put that back. But I'm going to do it through the XAML window instead. Say click equals, and notice it says new event handler. Just click on that. Ensure event failed. Excellent. Normally, that'll work. It may have to do the fact that I deleted before and then redid it, but let's try it again. This may be Tim's wish list number 4. Yep. Tim's wish list number 4 is to fix that bug in the editor. But we go back over here, double click on an event, and we've really broken Visual Studio now. So this is one of those things where, when in doubt, we're going to go ahead and restart the application and see if that doesn't solve our problem. So close out Visual Studio, and we'll open it back up in just a minute, and we'll try this again. So let's go to Open Project Solution. We're going to find ours, WPF Demo. Open it back up. And now let's try this again. Click equals, now let's tab, and it fills it right in. Submit button underscore click. Come over here. There's our submit button underscore click. So if you see that bug in the editor, and that's all you need to do to fix it, is just save everything, close it down, open it back up, and then try it again. But just type click equals, and then when it comes up with that new event, just tab on it or double click on it, and it will create your code for you. So in here, we're just going to do a very, very simple message box.show, and we'll just say, $, double quotes, hello, space, and then we'll do the first name text dot text, and that's just the person's first name, whatever they typed in the box. So that's just a really simple submit button event we're going to do. So let's run this now just to show that this event works and that our text box works and that it looks all pretty. So let's say, Tim, run me, hello, Tim. Excellent. So our WPF window works, and our text box works, our button works, and in fact, we can resize as we wanted to. Notice it doesn't shrink really nicely yet. That's something we can add in the future to make this actually grow or shrink depending on the window size. Right now, it acts a little more like WinForms, and so we haven't really taken advantage of a lot of the benefits of WPF quite yet, but we'll get there. But for this demo, we're going to kind of stop at that point. We're not going to go way in depth in WPF. I'll do some future videos to kind of give you a little more targeted updates on WPF and kind of help you with some speed bumps you might have in WPF. But before we go, I want to deal with that annoying bar that pops up that's there. I'm going to show you how to get rid of this. All right, to get rid of that box, let's go to Tools, Options. And here there's options for everything, it seems like. But I come down here to Debugging and look at our general window. And then scroll down. We have this Enable UI Debugging Tools for XAML. And inside here we have Show Runtime Tools in Application. Uncheck that box. Hit OK. And now we start this up. We won't have that black bar anymore, or that black bar with the icons on it. So let's go on. So if you don't want that, that's what you do. Just go to Tools, Options, Debugging, General, and then search for Show Runtime Tools in Application. The other thing you could do is say Show Runtime in our search box, and it takes you right here, Show Runtime Tools in Application, and uncheck that. So that's no way to get in there real quick. Or you can type, XAML, and only find the things that are related to XAML. But it's a little harder, I think, to get to. And it only shows the one that specifically says XAML, so you don't see that one option there. So, but that search box is really helpful if you're trying to find something. In this case, it would be show runtime tools and application. So let's type show runtime tools, and it's right there. So it's up to you how you get to it, but the important thing is that you know how to fix it. And if you want it back, just check the box again. So that's WPF, kind of in a nutshell. There's a whole lot more we have to go over. At some point, we will do that. For example, the combo box is a lot different than you're used to, and so we have to do a video on that. But as you get deeper into WPF, and as you start to use it, there's a whole lot of power here that, first of all, if you're going to use WPF, you should really be taking advantage of that power. Because otherwise, it really is a WinForm application that's more complicated. And that's no fun. But the other thing is, you should probably learn a framework like MVVM, Model View View Model. And it's a little more complicated, but it's worth it in the end because it allows you to do a whole lot more advanced stuff with WPF. And I'll, at some point, do a video on this, but in the meantime, I want to at least show you my recommendation for a tool for MVVM. Now, you can do MVVM on your own, kind of roll your own right in just the native WPF. But let's put this way. This is my end game for you. If you're going to do WPF, you really need to do MVVM. And if you're going to do MVVM, the easiest way of doing it and the most powerful and the most complete way of doing it would be to use a tool called Caliburn Micro. So on the references, manage NuGet packages, go to browse, and just type Caliburn Micro. This right here by Rob Eisenberg. This is a great tool. Still being updated. He's now on version 3, which is great. I mean, he's done a lot of work on this. He's got a team around him now. But this tool here makes MVVM easier in WPF because it's a complicated subject, and it also allows you to kind of fit into a model or to a mold that kind of gets in the groove of how MVVM works. And again, I know this is kind of end game stuff, but depending on where you are with WPF, if you're already comfortable with XAML and how it works and that kind of stuff, I'd say move this direction if you can. That's just my recommendation. It's my 2 cents. You can take it or leave it. Definitely leave a comment down below if you've used it before or if you thought about it. There are some documentation, some tutorials out there that work with Caliburn Micro or show Caliburn Micro. They're not complete. There's not this be-all, end-all wonderful documentation. But that's kind of how it goes with open source projects like this. It's a whole lot easier to get the code working than it is to document it well, especially with how fast the code changes. So I'll at some point go over that because I'm kind of a fanboy of Caliburn Micro. It's really made life easier for me, and so I like to show it off and kind of get you to like it as well. But that's kind of end game. Before that, I'll let you get more comfortable with XAML, get more comfortable with opening multiple forms and kind of nesting forms or creating controls and other stuff like that you can do with WPF. But for now, this is an overview. This is a very start of WPF. I wanted to show you just some of the things you can do right off the bat. Now, your homework is to go try this out. Build something yourself in WPF and see what things you run into, what problems you have. And then here's what you do. Come back here and post a comment down below and say, this is where I got stuck, or this is the problem I had, or this is what I find confusing. Because I'm going to take those and use those as a way to create new videos. So I'm going to say, okay, everyone's getting stuck on drop downs. Let's go ahead and create a drop down video. And that's going to be one that's going to be coming for sure. But if everyone gets stuck on a certain topic or a certain thing that's confusing, I'll create a video for that as well. Also, go to Facebook and interact there, because they'll have some polls up. And here's the stuff I'm thinking about. Which one do you want to see first? Let me know, and we'll go from there. All right? Don't forget to hit like on this video. I'd love if you do that. If you didn't like it, hit don't like or the thumbs down. Give me feedback. Let me know if you like it or don't like it, and what you want to see more of. Leave a comment down below. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. All right? Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, I am Tim Corey.